Fireside Tailes with Wolfgang. Episode 8. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions YouTube channel, CAPS Media Television Channel 6, KPPQ-LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Greetings and salutations. Thank you for tuning in to Fireside Tailes with Wolfgang. I am Hunter Ackerman. Wolfgang and I would like to welcome you all for readings of some world-renowned classics. So, Wolfus, what would you like to hear? Edit from Walden by Henry David Thoreau. Time is but the stream I go a-fishing in. I drink at it. But while I drink, I see the sandy bottom and detect how shallow it is. Its thin current slides away, but eternity remains. I would drink deeper, fish in the sky whose pebbly bottom is pebbly with stars. I cannot count one. I know not the first letter of the alphabet. I've always been regretting that I was not as wise as the day I was born. The intellect is a cleaver. It discerns and rifts its way into the secret of things. I do not wish to be any more busy with my hands than is necessary. My head is hands and feet. I feel all my best faculties concentrated in it. My instinct tells me that my head is an organ for burrowing, as some creatures use their snout and forepaws, and with it I would mine and burrow my way through these hills. I think that the richest vein is somewhere hereabouts, so by the divining rod in thin, rising vapors I judge, and here I will begin to mine. Excerpt from chapter 18. Conclusion. To the sick, the doctors wisely recommend a change of air and scenery. Thank heaven, here is not all the world. The buckeye does not grow in New England, and the mockingbird is rarely heard here. The wild goose is more of a cosmopolitanite than we. He breaks his fast in Canada, takes a luncheon in the Ohio, and plumes himself for the night in a southern bayou. Even the bison, to some extent, keeps pace with the seasons, cropping the pastures of the Colorado, only till a greener and sweeter grass awaits him by the Yellowstone. Yet we think that if rail fences are pulled down and stone walls piled up on our farms, bounds are henceforth set to our lives and our fates decided. If you are chosen town clerk, forsooth, you cannot go to Tierra del Fuego this summer, but you may go to the land of infernal fire nevertheless. The universe is wider than our views of it. I left the woods for as good a reason as I went there. Perhaps it seemed to me that I had several more lives to live and could not spare any more time for that one. It's remarkable how easily and insensibly we fall into a particular route and make a beaten track for ourselves. I had not lived there a week before my feet wore a path from my door to the pond side, and though it is 5 or 6 years since I trod it, it is still quite distinct. It is true, I fear, that others may have fallen into it and so helped to keep it open. The surface of the earth is soft and impressible by the feet of men, and so with the paths which the mind travels. How worn and dusty then must be the highways of the world, how deep the ruts of tradition and conformity. I did not wish to take a cabin passage but rather to go before the mast and on the deck of the world, for there I could best see the moonlight amidst the mountains. I do not wish to go below now. I learned this, at least, by my experiment, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in the common hours. He will put some things behind, will pass an invisible boundary. New, universal, and more liberal laws will begin to establish themselves around and within him, or the old laws be expanded and interpreted in his favor in a more liberal sense, and he will live with the license of a higher order of beings. In proportion as he simplifies his life, the laws of the universe will appear less complex, and solitude will not be solitude, nor poverty, nor weakness, weakness. If you have built castles in the air, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now, put the foundations under them. I desire to speak somewhere without bounds, like a man in a waking moment, to men in their waking moments, for I am convinced that I cannot exaggerate enough even to lay the foundation of a true expression. I do not suppose that I have attained to obscurity, but I should be proud if no more fatal fault were found within my pages on this score than was found with the Walden ice. Southern customers objected to its blue color, which is the evidence of its purity, as if it were muddy, and preferred the Cambridge ice, which is white, but tastes of weeds. The purity men love is like the mists which envelop the earth, and not like the azure ether beyond. Some are dinning in our ears that we Americans, and moderns generally, are intellectual dwarfs compared with the ancients, or even with the Elizabethan men. But what is that to the purpose? A living dog is better than a dead lion. Shall a man go and hang himself because he belongs to the race of pygmies and not be the biggest pygmy that he can? Let everyone mind his own business and endeavor to be what he was made. Why should we be in such desperate haste to succeed and in such desperate enterprises? If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. It is not important that he should mature as soon as an apple tree or an oak. Shall he turn his spring into summer? If the condition of things which we were made for is not yet, what were any reality which we can substitute? We will not be shipwrecked on a vain reality. Shall we with pains erect a heaven of blue glass over ourselves, though when it is done, we shall be sure to gaze still at the true ethereal heaven far above, as if the former were not? No face which we can give to a matter will stead us so well at last as the truth. This alone wears well. For the most part, we are not where we are, but in a false position. Through an infinity of our natures, we suppose a case and put ourselves into it, and hence are in two cases at the same time, and it is doubly difficult to get out. In sane moments, we regard only the facts, the case that is. Say what you have to say, not what you ought. Any truth is better than make-believe. However mean your life is, meet it and live it. Do not shun it and call it hard names. It is not so bad as you are. It looks poorest when you are richest. Love your life. The setting sun is reflected from the windows of the almshouse as brightly as from the rich man's abode. The snow melts before its door as early in the spring. I do not see but a quiet mind may live as contentedly there and have as cheering thoughts as in a palace. The town's poor seem to me often to live the most independent lives of any. Maybe they are simply great enough to receive without misgiving. Do not trouble yourself much to get new things, whether clothes or friends. Things do not change. We change. This is Cousin Tribulations' story by Louisa May Alcott. Dear Marys, as a subject appropriate to the season, I want to tell you about a New Year's breakfast, which I had when I was a little girl. What do you think it was? A slice of dry bread and an apple. This is how it happened, and it's a true story, every word. As we came down to breakfast that morning, with very shiny faces and spandy clean aprons, we found Father alone in the dining room. "Happy New Year, Papa! Where's Mother?" we cried. A little boy came begging and said they were starving at home, so your mother went to see, and here she is. As Papa spoke, in came Mama, looking very cold, rather sad, and very much excited. "Children, don't begin till you hear what I have to say," she cried, and we sat staring at her with the breakfast untouched before us. Not far away from here lies a poor woman with a little newborn baby. 6 children are huddled into one bed to keep from freezing, for they have no fire. There is nothing to eat over there, and the oldest boy came here to tell me they were starving this bitter, cold day. My little girls, will you give them your breakfast as a New Year's gift? We sat a minute, silent, and looked at the nice, hot porridge, the creamy milk, good bread and butter, for we were brought up like English children and never drank tea or coffee or ate anything but porridge for our breakfast. I wish we'd eaten it up, thought I, for I was rather a selfish child and very hungry. "I'm so glad you came before we began," said Nan cheerfully. "May I go and help carry it to the poor little children?" asked Beth, who had the tenderest heart that ever beat under a pinafore. "I can carry the lassie pot," said little May, proudly giving the things that she loved the best. "And I shall take all the porridge," I burst in, heartily ashamed of my first feeling. You shall put on your things and help me. When we come back, we'll get something to eat, said Mother, beginning to pile the bread and butter into a big basket. We were soon ready, and the procession set out. First Papa, with a basket of wood on one arm and a coal on the other. Mama next, with a bundle of warm things and the teapot. Nan and I carried a pail of hot porridge between us, and each a pitcher of milk. Beth brought some cold meat. Mary, she carried the little lassie pot, and her old hood and boots. And Betsy brought up the rear with a bag of potatoes and some meal. Fortunately, it was early, and we went along back streets, so few people saw us and no one laughed at the funny party. What a poor, bare, miserable place it was, to be sure. Broken windows, no fire, ragged clothes, wailing baby, sick mother, and a pile of pale, hungry children cuddled under one quilt, trying to keep warm. And how the eyes stared, so big and huge, wondering, and the blue lips smiled as we came in. "Ach, mein Gott, it is the good angels that come to us," cried the poor woman with tears of joy. "Funny angels in woolen hoods and red mittens," said I, and they all laughed. Then we fell to work, and in 15 minutes, it really did seem as if fairies had been at work there. Papa made a splendid fire in the old fireplace and stopped up the broken window with his own hat and coat. Mama set up the shivering children around the fire and wrapped the poor woman in warm things. Betsy and the rest of us spread the table and fed the starving little ones. "Das ist gut. Ah, nice, dear angel kinder," cried the poor little things as they ate and smiled and basked in the warm blaze. We'd never been called angel children before. We thought it was very charming. I mean, especially I, who had often been told I was a regular Sancho. What fun it was. And Papa, with a towel for an apron, fed the smallest child. Mama dressed the poor little newborn baby as tenderly as if it had been her own. Betsy gave the mother gruel and tea and comforted her with the assurance of better days for all. Nan, Lou, Beth, and May flew about among the 7 children, talking and laughing and trying to understand their funny, broken little English. It was a very happy breakfast, though we didn't get any of it. And when we came away, leaving them all so comfortable and promising to bring clothes and food by and by, I think there were not in all the world any happier children than the hungry little girls who gave away their breakfast and contented themselves with a bit of bread and an apple on a New Year's Day. This is a story by Mark Twain. And as much of Mark Twain's stories as we think of as taken place in the heartland and steamboats in the Mississippi River, this one actually takes place in California, just a few hours north of here. This is called The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do. And I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that If I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me nearly to death with some infernal reminiscence of him as long and tedious as it should be completely useless to me. If that was the design, it certainly succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably in the bar-room stove of the old dilapidated tavern in the ancient mining camp of Angels. And I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me good day. I told him a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel, who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angels Camp. And by the way, Californians east of San Francisco might know Angels Camp. It's a small town. It's really there. It's still there. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner, blockaded me there with his chair, then sat me down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled. He never frowned. He never changed his voice from the gentle, flowing key to which he tuned the initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, but all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. To me, the spectacle of a man drifting serenely along through such a queer yarn without ever smiling was exquisitely absurd. As I have said before, I asked him to tell me what he knew of Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and he replied as follows. I let him go on in his own way and never interrupted him once. There was a fella here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of 49. Maybe it was the spring of 50, I don't recollect exactly. Somehow, though, what makes me think it was one or the other is because I remember the big flume wasn't finished when he first came to the camp. But anyway, he was a curious man, about always betting on anything that turned up you ever see. If you could get anybody to bet anything on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Anyway, that just suited the other man, would suit him anyway. Just so long as he's got a bet, he was satisfied. But still, he was lucky. Uncommonly lucky. He most always come out winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned that feller had offered to bet on it. And take any side as you please. As I was just telling you, if there was a horse race, you'd find him flush. Or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there was two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. Or if there was a camp meeting, he would be there regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about here. And so he was, too, and a good man.
If he was ever seen a straddlebug start to go anywhere, you would bet you how long it'd take him to get wherever he was going to go. And if you took him up, he would follow that straddlebug to Mexico. But what he would find out where he was bound for and how long he was still on the road, still lots of boys here, they've seen that Smiley, and they could tell you that about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He would bet on anything, the damnedest feller. Parson Walker's wife laid real sickly once, and for a good while. And it seemed like they weren't going to be able to save her. One morning he comes in, and Smiley asked her how she was, and he said she was considerable better, thank the Lord for his infinite mercy, and coming on so smart as that with the blessing of Providence, she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, well, I'll risk 2.5 that she don't, anyway. This year Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag, but that was only in fun. You know, because, of course, she was faster than that, and he used to win money on that horse. For all she was so slow and always had the asthma or the distemper or the consumption or something of that kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 yard start, then pass her underway, but always at the fag end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate, like and come cavorting and straddling up and scattering her legs around the limber, sometimes in the air, sometimes out to the side amongst the fences, and kicking them up more dust and raising more racket with her coughing and her sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about a neck ahead as far as you could cipher it down. And he had a little small bull pup that took to him like you'd think he was worth a man's cent, but sat around and look ornery and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up on him, he was a different dog. His underjaw would begin to stick out like the forecastle of a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine savage like the furnaces. And a dog might tackle him and bullyrag him and bite him and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times. And Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson, by the way, would never let on but till he was satisfied and hadn't expected nothing else. And the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time till the money was all up. Then, all of a sudden, he'd grab that other dog just by the joint of his hind leg and freeze on it. Not chew, you understand, but only just grip it and hang on till they thronged up the sponge if it was a year. Smiley always come out winner on that pup, till he harnessed a dog once that didn't have no hind legs, because they'd been sawed off by a circular saw. And when the thing had gone along far enough and the money was all up and he come to make a snatch for his pet hold, he saw in a minute how he'd been imposed upon and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak. And he appeared surprised. And then he looked sort of discouraged like, and he didn't try no more to win the fight. And so he got shucked out bad. He gave Smiley a look as much as to say his heart was broke and that it was his fault for putting up a dog that had no hind leg for him to take a hold of, which was his main dependence in a fight. And then he limped off a piece and laid down and died. He was a good pup, that Andrew Jackson. He would have made a name for himself if he had lived, for the stuff was in him. And he had genius. I know it, because he had no opportunities to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he had no talent. It was always made me feel sorry when I think of that last fight of his and the way it turned out. Such a shame. Well, this here Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kinds of things that you couldn't resist. And you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. He catched a frog one day and took him home and said he calculated to educate him. And so, he ain't never done nothing for 3 months but sit back in his yard and learn that frog to jump. And you betcha he did learn him too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute, you'd see that frog whirl in the air like a donut. See him turn one somersault, maybe a couple if he got a good start. And he'd come down flat-footed all right, like a cat. Got him so up in the matter of catching flies, kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as far as we could see him. Smiley said all the frog wanted was education. And he could do most anything, and I believe him. Why? Why? I've seen him set Daniel Webster down here on this floor. Daniel Webster was the name of the frog. And sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies." And quicker than you could wink, he'd spring straight up, snake a fly off on the counter there, and flop down on the floor again, solid as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he had no idea he'd been doing any more than any frog might do. You never seen a frog so modest and straightforward as he was. For all he was so gifted. And when it come to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever did see. Jumping on a dead level, that was his strong suit, you understand. And when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red cent. Smiley was monstrous proud of that frog, as well as he might be, for fellers that had traveled, been everywheres, and all said he laid over any frog that they ever did see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box. You're the beast. And he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day, a stranger in the camp, he was come across him with his box and says, "What might that be you got there in that yonder box?" Smiley says, sort of indifferent, like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary, maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it, looked at it careful, turned around this way and that and says, "Oh, so 'tis. Well, what's it good for?" "Well," says Smiley, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing. I should judge he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again and another long, particular look, gave it back to Smiley and says very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you had experience, and maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyway, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The fella studied a minute and then says, kind of sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here and I ain't got no frog. But if I had a frog, I'd bet you." And then Smiley says, "Well, that's all right. You get a hold of my box a minute, I'll go and get you a frog." So the feller took the box, put up his $40 along with Smiley's, and sit down to wait. So he sat there a good while, thinking to himself, and he got the frog out, and he pried his mouth open and took a teaspoon and filled him full of quail shot. That's little lead BBs, if you don't know what that term means. Filled him pretty near up to his chin, set him on the floor. Smiley, he went down to the swamp. He slopped around in the mud for a long time. Finally, he catched himself a frog, fetched him in, gives him to this feller and says, "Now, if you were ready, set him alongside of Daniel with his forepaws, just even with Daniel, and I'll give the word." Then he says, 1, 2, 3, jump. And him and the feller touched the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off. But Daniel didn't give a heave and hissed up his shoulders like a Frenchman. But it wasn't no use. He wouldn't budge. He had planted as solid as an anvil, and he couldn't do more than stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised. And he was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away. And when he was going out the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulders this way at Daniel and says again, very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley stood scratching his head, looking down at Daniel for a long time. At last he says, "I do wonder what in the nation throwed that frog off. Wonder if there ain't something matter with him. He appears to look mighty baggy somehow." And he catched Daniel by the nape of the neck and lifted him up and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds." And he turned him upside down and belched out a double handful of shot. Then he sees how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down, took off after that feller, but he never catched him. And here, Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard, got up to see what was wanted. Turning to me, as he moved away, he said, "Just you sit where you are, stranger. Rest ain't easy, but I ain't gonna be gone a second." But by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley. And so I started away. At the door, I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. "Well, there's your Smiley. He had a yellow one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banana, and..." "Okay, hang Smiley and his afflicted cow," I muttered good-naturedly, and bidding the old gentleman good day, I departed. This is The Skylight Room by O. Henry. First, Mrs. Parker would show you the double parlors. You would not dare to interrupt her description of their advantages and of the merits of the gentleman who had occupied them for 8 years. Then you would manage to stammer forth the confession that you were neither a doctor nor a dentist. Mrs. Parker's manner of receiving the admission was such that you could never afterward entertain the same feeling toward your parents who had neglected to bring you up in one of those professions that fitted Mrs. Parker's parlors. So next,
You ascended one flight of stairs and looked at the second floor back room at $8. Convinced by her second floor manner that it was worth the $12 that Mr. Tootsenbury always paid for it until he left to take charge of his brother's orange plantation in Florida near Palm Beach, where Mrs. McIntyre always spent the winters, that had double front room with a private bath, you managed to babble that you wanted something still cheaper. If you survived Mrs. Parker's scorn, you were taken to look at Mr. Skitter's large hall room on the third floor. Mr. Skitter's room was not vacant. He wrote plays and smoked cigarettes in it all day long. But every room hunter was made to visit his room and admire the lambrequins, like these hanging drape things that you just sort of put over doors. After each visit, Mr. Skitter, from the fright caused by possible eviction, would pay something on his rent. Then, if you still stood on one foot with your hot hand clutching the 3 moist dollars in your pocket and hoarsely proclaim your hideous and culpable poverty, never more would Miss Parker be cicerone of yours. She would honk loudly the name Clara and show you her back and march downstairs. Then Clara, the colored maid, would escort you up the carpeted ladder that served for the 4th flight and show you the Skylight room. It occupied 7 by 8 feet of floor space at the middle of the hall. On each side of it was a dark wooded panel, closet or storeroom. In it was an iron cot, a washstand, and a chair. A shelf was the dresser. Its 4 bare walls seemed to close in upon you like the sides of a coffin. Your hand crept to your throat. You gasped. You looked up as if from a well and breathed once more. Through the glass of the little skylight, you saw a square of blue infinity. $2, Clara would say in her half contemptuous, half Tuscagenial tones. One day, Miss Leeson came hunting for a room. She carried a typewriter made to be lugged about by a much larger lady. She was a very little girl with eyes and hair that had kept on growing after she had stopped. She kind of looked like a Disney character. And her eyes always looked as if they were saying, "Goodness me, why didn't you keep up with us?" Mrs. Parker showed her the double parlors. "In this closet," she said, "one could keep a skeleton, or anesthetic, or coal." Miss Leeson said with a shiver, "But I'm neither a doctor nor a dentist." Mrs. Parker gave her the incredulous, pitying, sneering, icy stare that she kept for those who failed to qualify as doctors or dentists, and led the way to the 2nd floor back. $8? Said Miss Leeson. "Dear me, I'm not heady if I do look green. I'm just a poor little working girl. Show me something higher and lower." Mr. Skitter jumped and strewed the floor with cigarette stubs at the rap on his door. "Excuse me, Mr. Skitter," said Mrs. Parker with her demon's smile at his pale looks. I didn't know you were in. I asked the lady to have a look at your lambrequins." too lovely for anything," said Miss Leeson, smiling in exactly the way angels do. After they had gone, Mr. Skidder got very busy erasing the tall, black-haired heroine from his latest unproduced play, and inserting a very small, charming heroine with heavy, bright hair and vivacious features. "Anna Held will jump at this," said Mr. Skidder to himself, putting his feet up against the lambrequins and disappearing in a cloud of smoke like an aerial cuttlefish. Presently, the tocsin call of "Clara!" sounded to the world the state of Miss Leeson's purse. A dark goblin seized her, mounted a Stygian stairway, thrust her into a vault with a glimmer of light in its top, and muttered the menacing and cabalistic words, $2. "I'll take it," sighed Miss Leeson, slinking down upon the squeaky iron bed. Every day, Miss Leeson went out to work. At night, she brought home papers with handwriting on them and made copies with her typewriter. Sometimes she had no work at night, and then she would sit on the steps of the high stoop with the other roomers. Miss Leeson was not intended for a skylight room when the plans were drawn for her creation. She was happy. She was light-hearted. She was full of tender, whimsical fantasies. Once, she let Mr. Skidder read to her 3 acts of his great, unpublished comedy, It's No Kid, or The Heir of the Subway. There was rejoicing among the gentlemen roomers whenever Miss Leeson had time to sit on the steps for an hour or two, but Miss Longnecker was a really tall blonde who taught in a public school and said, "Well, really," to everything anyone said. The same Miss Longnecker sat on the top step and sniffed. And Miss Dorn, who shot at the moving ducks at Coney. It's like little mechanical things you shoot on with a pellet gun sort of thing. They're not real ducks. But Miss Dorn, who shot at the moving ducks at Coney every Sunday and worked in a department store, sat on the bottom step and sniffed. Miss Leeson sat on the middle step, and all the men would quickly group around her. Especially Mr. Skidder, who had cast her in his mind for the star in a private, romantic, unspoken drama in real life. And especially Mr. Hoover, who was 45, fat, flush, and foolish. Oh, and especially very young Mr. Evans, who set up a hollow cough to induce her to ask him to leave off of cigarettes. The men voted her the funniest and jolliest ever, but the sniffs on the top step and the lower step were implacable. I pray you, let the drama halt while the chorus stalks to the footlights and drops an Epicedian tear upon the fatness of Mr. Hoover. Tune the pipes to the tragedy of tallow, the bane of bulk, the calamity of corpulence. Tried out Falstaff might have rendered more romance to the ton than would have Romeo's rickety ribs to the ounce. A lover may sigh, but he must not puff. To the train of Momus are the fat men remended. In vain beats the faithfulest heart above a 52-inch belt. Avant, Hoover. Hoover, 45, flush and foolish, might carry off Helen herself. Hoover, 45, flush, foolish, and fat? He is meat for perdition. There was never a chance for you, Hoover. As Mrs. Parker's roomers sat thus one summer's evening, Miss Leeson looked up into the firmament and cried with her little gay laugh, "What? There's Billy Jackson. I can see him from down here, too." All looked up, some at the windows of skyscrapers, some casting about for an airship, Jackson guided. "It's that star," explained Miss Leeson, pointing with a tiny finger. "Not the big one that twinkles, the steady blue one near it. I can see it every night through my skylight. I named it Billy Jackson." "Well, really," said Miss Longnecker, "I didn't know you were an astronomer, Miss Leeson." "Oh, yes," said the small stargazer. "I know as much as any of them about the style of sleeves they're going to wear next fall in Mars." "Well, really," said Miss Longnecker. "The star you refer to is Gamma of the constellation Cassiopeia. It is nearly of the second magnitude, and its meridian passage is—" "Oh," said the very young Mr. Evans, "I think Billy Jackson is a much better name for it." "Same here," said Mr. Hoover, loudly breathing defiance to Miss Longnecker. "I think Miss Leeson has just as much a right to name stars as any of those old astrologers had." "Well, really," said Miss Longnecker. "I wonder whether it's a shooting star," remarked Miss Dorn. "I hit 9 ducks and a rabbit out of 10 in the gallery at Coney on Sunday." "He doesn't show up very well from down here," said Miss Leeson. "You ought to see him from my room. You know, you can see stars even at daytime from the bottom of the well. At night, my room is like the shaft of a coal mine, and it makes Billy Jackson look like the big diamond pin that Night fastens her kimono with." There came a time after that when Miss Leeson brought no formidable papers home to copy. And when she went out in the morning, instead of working, she went from office to office and let her heart melt away in the drip of cold refusals transmitted through insolent office boys. And this went on. There came an evening when she wearily climbed Mrs. Parker's stoop at the hour when she always returned from her dinner at the restaurant. But she had had no dinner. As she stepped into the hall, Mr. Hoover met her and seized his chance. He asked her to marry him, and his fatness hovered above her like an avalanche. She dodged and caught the balustrade. He tried for her hand, and she raised it and smote him weakly in the face. Step by step, she went upstairs, dragging herself by the railing. She passed Mr. Skidder's door as he was red inking a stage direction for Myrtle Delorme, who's Miss Leeson's character, in his unaccepted comedy, to pirouette across from left to the side of the Count. Up the carpeted ladder, she crawled at last and opened the door of the Skylight room. She was too weak to light the lamp or to undress. She fell upon the iron cot, her fragile body scarcely hollowing the worn springs. And in that Erebus of the Skylight room, she slowly raised her heavy eyelids and smiled. For Billy Jackson was smiling down upon her, calm and bright and constant through the skylight. There was no world about her. She was sunk in a pit of blackness, but with that small square of pallid light framing the star that she had so whimsically and oh so ineffectually named. Miss Longnecker must be right. It was Gamma of the constellation Cassiopeia and not Billy Jackson. And yet, she could not let it be Gamma. As she lay on her back, she tried twice to raise her arm. The third time, she got 2 thin fingers to her lips and blew a kiss out of the black pit to Billy Jackson. Her arm fell back limply. "Goodbye, Billy," she murmured faintly. "You're millions of miles away, and you won't even twinkle once. But you kept where I could see you most of the time up there, when there wasn't anything else but darkness to look at, didn't you? Millions of miles." Goodbye, Billy Jackson. Clara, the maid, found the door locked at 10 the next day, and they forced it open. Vinegar and the slapping of wrists and burnt feathers proving of no avail, someone ran to phone for an ambulance. In due time, it backed up to the door with much gong clanging and the capable young medico in his white linen coat, ready, active, confident with his smooth face, half debonair, half grim, danced up the steps. "Ambulance call to 49, he said briefly. "What's the trouble?" Oh, yes, doctor," sniffed Mrs. Parker, as though her trouble in the house was the greater. "I can't think what can be the matter with her. Nothing we could do or bring her to. It's a young woman, Miss Elise. Yes, young Miss Elise Leeson. Never before in my house." "What room?" cried the doctor in a terrible voice to which Miss Parker was a stranger. "The Skylight room. It evidently, the ambulance doctor was familiar with the location of Skylight rooms. He was gone up the stairs, 4 at a time. Mrs. Parker followed slowly as her dignity demanded. On the first landing, she met him coming back, bearing the astronomer in her arms. He stopped and let loose the practiced scalpel of his tongue, but not loudly. Gradually, Mrs. Parker crumpled as a stiff garment that slips down from a nail. Ever afterward, there remained crumples in her mind and body. Sometimes her curious rumors would ask her what the doctor said to her. "Let that be," she would answer. "If I can get forgiveness for having heard it, I will be satisfied." The ambulance physician strode with his burden through the pack of hounds that follow the curiosity chase, and even they fell back along the sidewalk abashed, for his face was that of one who bears his own dead. They noticed that he did not lay her down upon the prepared bed, and all that he said was, "Drive like hell, Wilson," to the driver. That is all. Is it a story? In the next morning's paper, I saw a little news item, and the last sentence of it might help you, as it helped me to weld the incidences together. It recounted the reception into Bellevue Hospital of a young woman who had been removed from number 49 East Street, suffering from debility induced by starvation. It concluded with these words: "Dr. William Jackson, the ambulance physician who attended the case, says the patient will recover." Thank you for joining us for this episode of Fireside Tales with Wolfgang. To view more of my work, check out my YouTube channel at Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. Directed by Hunter Ackerman. Endorsed by Wolfgang Beastly. Produced by GWC Productions. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions YouTube channel, CAPS Media Television Channel 6, KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network.